They were supposed to be easy targets, slow merchant ships packed with food, fuel, and ammunition, lumbering across the Atlantic at 8 knots. But by May 1943, German U-boat commanders who had once hunted these convoys with impunity were dying at a rate that made continuation of the campaign impossible. In a single month, 41 U-boats went to the bottom. The hunters had become the hunted. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. In September 1939, the German Navy possessed just 57 submarines. Fewer than half were ocean-going boats capable of reaching the Atlantic shipping lanes. Yet within hours of war's declaration, U-boat commanders proved their potential. On the evening of September 3rd, Oberleutnant Fritz Julius Lemp aboard U-30 spotted the British passenger liner Athenia steaming west from Liverpool. He fired. The torpedo struck amidships. 112 civilians died, including 28 Americans. The act violated standing orders and international law, but it announced to the world that Germany intended to wage unrestricted submarine warfare against Allied shipping. The tool they would use was the Type 7 U-boat, a vessel that would define the Battle of the Atlantic for the next 6 years. The Type 7 measured just over 200 feet long and displaced 769 tons. Its pressure hull, built from welded steel plates 3/4 of an inch thick, could withstand depths of nearly 500 feet before catastrophic failure. 4 diesel engines drove the boat at 17 knots on the surface, but submerged, electric motors could manage only 8 knots for 1 hour before battery exhaustion forced a return to the surface. The boat carried 14 torpedoes, 5 tubes forward and 1 aft, each weapon capable of sinking a merchant ship with a single hit. 50 men lived inside this steel cylinder for patrols lasting 8 to 12 weeks. They shared 1 toilet, they ate canned food, they slept in bunks stacked 3 high, wedged between torpedo storage racks and machinery that never stopped clattering. The air reeked of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and mold. But the Type 7 worked. It was reliable, maneuverable, and could be built quickly. Between 1940 and 1945, German shipyards launched 709 Type 7 boats, more than any other submarine class in history. The German doctrine for employing these boats came from Karl Dönitz, a former U-boat commander from the First World War who had spent years developing tactical concepts for a future naval conflict. Dönitz understood that Germany could not match Britain's surface fleet ship for ship. Instead, he advocated massed submarine attacks against merchant convoys. He called the tactic Rudeltaktik, Wolfpack tactics. The concept was simple. U-boats would patrol in extended lines across known convoy routes. When one boat spotted a convoy, it would shadow the formation and transmit position reports back to headquarters in occupied France. Dönitz would then direct other boats to converge on the target. Once assembled, the pack would attack at night on the surface, using darkness and their low profile to slip between escort vessels, fire torpedoes into the convoy's center, then escape into the blackness. The tactic relied on centralized command, aggressive captains, and radio communication. It also required that Allied escorts be too few and too poorly equipped to respond effectively. In the war's first year, convoy escorts were indeed inadequate. Britain began the war with insufficient destroyers, most allocated to fleet protection rather than convoy duty. The escorts available were often elderly vessels armed with obsolete weapons. Their primary anti-submarine tool was ASDIC, an active sonar system that transmitted sound pulses underwater and listened for echoes. ASDIC worked, but only against submerged submarines, and even then its range rarely exceeded 1,500 yards. The problem was that U-boats attacked on the surface. At night, a surfaced U-boat presented a target barely 10 feet high. Lookouts equipped with binoculars might spot a periscope wake in daylight, but at night, U-boats were nearly invisible. Radar existed, but remained primitive and rare. Depth charges, cylindrical drums packed with 300 pounds of TNT, could destroy a submarine, but only if the escort passed directly over the target, dropped the charge, and hoped the pressure wave from detonation crushed the hull. It was an imprecise weapon. Against these defenses, U-boat commanders achieved stunning success. In October 1940, Convoy SC-7 departed Sydney, Nova Scotia, with 35 merchant ships bound for Britain. Escorts consisted of a single sloop and 2 corvettes. On October 17th, U-boats made contact. Over the next 4 nights, 7 submarines tore into the convoy. 20 ships went down. 563 men died. Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer, aboard U-99, sank 7 ships in 2 attacks. The escorts could do nothing. On the night of October 19th, as SC-7 burned and scattered, another convoy, HX-79, sailed into the same pack. This convoy had 11 escorts, including 2 destroyers. It made no difference. 12 more ships sank. The Wolfpacks had proven their worth. From the German perspective, the period from July 1940 to February 1941 was Die glückliche Zeit, the happy time. U-boat crews called it the Golden Age. Losses were minimal, targets were plentiful, captains competed for tonnage totals. Kretschmer alone sank 44 ships totaling 273,000 tons before his capture in March 1941. Joachim Schepke in U-100 and Günther Prien in U-47 became national heroes. German propaganda celebrated them as modern knights. Newsreels showed smiling crews returning to bases at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, pennants flying for each ship sunk, officers decorated with the Knight's Cross. The submarines operated from concrete bunkers built along the French Atlantic coast, massive structures with roofs 16 feet thick, impervious to bombing. Inside, crews rested between patrols in relative comfort, while shipyard workers repaired damage and loaded torpedoes. The war at sea seemed winnable, but the Allies were adapting. By mid-1941, escort numbers increased. New corvettes entered service, small vessels built quickly in Canadian and British yards, designed specifically for convoy protection. They were uncomfortable platforms pitching violently in Atlantic swells, but they carried depth charges and ass-duck and could be produced in large numbers. Aircraft began to matter. Short-range planes from Britain and Iceland could patrol the eastern and western approaches to convoy routes, forcing U-boats to submerge during daylight hours. Submerged, the Type 7 was slow and nearly blind, dependent on periscope observation and limited battery power. The Allies also began to organize escort groups, teams of ships that trained together, developed coordinated tactics, and stayed with convoys across the entire Atlantic rather than handing off responsibility mid-ocean. The Royal Navy established specialized support groups, flotillas of destroyers and frigates that could be directed to reinforce convoys under attack. Slowly, the balance began to shift. Then came intelligence. The British Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park worked continuously to break German naval enigma codes. Success came in stages. By May 1941, cryptanalysts could read some German naval traffic with delays of only hours. The intelligence, codenamed Ultra, revealed U-boat positions, patrol lines, and operational orders. Armed with this knowledge, the Admiralty could reroute convoys around known concentrations of submarines. The Germans, aware that radio intercepts were possible, assumed their Enigma system was unbreakable. It wasn't. However, the Allies faced a mirror problem. German naval intelligence, B. Dienst, had broken British Naval Cipher No. 3 in October 1941. This system encrypted all convoy routing instructions. Throughout 1942, German code breakers read Allied messages almost in real time, allowing donuts to position Wolfpacks directly in the path of approaching convoys. Both sides possessed partial intelligence, neither aware that their own codes were compromised. The result was a bloody stalemate. The crisis came in 1943. By March, Dönitz commanded over 400 U-boats, with more than 200 operational at any given time. He deployed them in patrol lines stretching across the North Atlantic convoy routes, groups of 15 to 20 boats spaced 10 miles apart, creating barriers hundreds of miles long. Between March 16th and 20th, two convoys, SC-122 and HX-229, ran into a concentration of 38 U-boats. The battles lasted 4 days. 21 merchant ships went down, totaling 141,000 tons. Only one U-boat was sunk. It was the largest convoy battle of the war. Dönitz believed victory was near. He wrote in his war diary that if losses continued at this rate, Britain's ability to wage war would collapse within months. He was wrong. The technological and tactical situation was shifting faster than German intelligence could detect. In early 1943, several innovations converged. The first was centimetric radar, operating on a wavelength of 10 centimeters. Previous radar sets used meter-long waves that could not detect small targets like submarine conning towers. The new sets could. Installed on escort ships and aircraft, they allowed detection of surfaced U-boats at ranges exceeding 5 miles, even at night, even in fog. The Germans possessed no detector that could warn them they were being tracked. The second innovation was the Lee light, a powerful searchlight mounted on aircraft. Radar would guide the plane to the vicinity of a surfaced submarine. At close range, the light would snap on, illuminating the target for an attack run. U-boats caught on the surface while recharging batteries were destroyed before they could crash dive. The third was high-frequency direction finding, known as HUF-DUF. Compact enough to be installed on escort ships, these receivers could detect and triangulate the source of U-boat radio transmissions. Since Dönitz's tactics required constant radio communication between boats and headquarters, every transmission revealed the submarine's position. The fourth factor was air power. Very long-range B-24 Liberators, modified to carry extra fuel, began closing the mid-Atlantic air gap, the region beyond the reach of land-based aircraft where U-boats had previously operated with impunity. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant hulls, accompanied convoys, providing continuous air cover. Aircraft could remain over a convoy for hours, forcing submarines to stay submerged, slowly depleting their batteries, rendering them ineffective. From the U-boat commander's perspective, the Atlantic changed from a hunting ground into a killing zone. In April 1943, 15 boats were lost. Crews departing on patrol knew the statistics. 30% of boats never returned from their first mission. Overall survival rates were worse. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat service during the war, 30,000 died. In May, the losses accelerated. Convoys ONS-5, attacked by a Wolfpack of 30 boats, lost 12 merchant ships, but destroyed 7 U-boats in exchange. The pack had suffered nearly 25% casualties for minimal gain. On May 9th, U-266 was caught on the surface by a Sunderland flying boat and sunk with all hands. On May 11th, U-528 was destroyed by a Liberator south of Greenland. On May 12th, 3 boats were sunk in a single day. The crews transmitted frantic messages describing radar-equipped escorts closing in from all directions, depth charges detonating in patterns that gave no escape, aircraft appearing through cloud cover without warning. The iron confidence of 1940 had evaporated. On May 24, 1943, Gross Admiral Dönitz ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The decision was unprecedented. For the first time in the war, Germany conceded operational control of a theater. Dönitz wrote that losses had become unbearable, and that continuation of attacks with current technology would result in the annihilation of the U-boat force without corresponding success. 41 boats had been sunk in May alone, more than in any previous month, representing over 25% of operational strength. The Allies called it Black May, German submariners called it something else. They called it the end. The convoys continued. In the final 2 years of the war, U-boats returned to the Atlantic with improved radar detectors, snorkels that allowed diesel engines to run while submerged, and acoustic torpedoes designed to home on escort propeller noise. None of it mattered. Allied countermeasures evolved faster. More escort carriers entered service. Escort groups grew larger and more experienced. Aircraft patrolled constantly. In 1944, German yards launched over 200 U-boats, but operational effectiveness continued to decline. The boats were hunted before they reached operational areas. Coastal transit routes were swept by aircraft. Bases were blockaded. By the time Germany surrendered, 783 U-boats had been sunk. The Type 7, the weapon that was supposed to sever Britain's lifeline, had failed. Not because it was poorly designed, not because its crews lacked courage, but because industrial capacity, technological innovation, and operational intelligence had shifted decisively to the Allies. The U-boat commanders who survived the war returned to a destroyed nation. Their service, once celebrated as heroic, was re-examined in the context of total defeat. The question historians later asked was whether the U-boat campaign had ever been viable. The numbers suggest not. At its peak, the U-boat force sank shipping at a rate of 500,000 tons per month, but Allied shipyards, particularly in the United States, produced merchant vessels faster than submarines could sink them. In 1942 alone, American yards launched 8 million tons of new shipping. The U-boats were fighting a production war they could not win. Dönitz had calculated before the war that he needed 300 operational boats to sever Britain's supply lines. He never achieved that number, and when he approached it in 1943, the Allies had already developed the technology and tactics to neutralize the threat. The Wolfpacks had been effective against weak escorts in 1940. Against coordinated escort groups supported by aircraft and guided by ultra-intelligence, they were simply targets. What did U-boat captains think of Allied convoys? In 1940, they thought them vulnerable. In 1941, they thought them challenging. In 1942, they thought them dangerous. By 1943, they thought them fatal. The progression was not gradual, it was a collapse. The same captains who had sailed confidently into the Atlantic in the war's first years returned describing relentless pursuit, technological superiority they could not match, and a growing certainty that each patrol might be their last. The convoys themselves changed little in structure. They still consisted of merchant ships arranged in columns, still sailed at 8 or 9 knots, still followed predictable routes. But the defensive envelope around them had become impenetrable. Where once a single corvette might escort 30 ships, by 1943, a typical convoy had 8 to 12 dedicated escorts plus a support group on call, continuous air cover, radar surveillance, and routing intelligence that kept them away from known submarine concentrations. The psychological impact on U-boat crews became severe. Men departing Lorient or Bergen knew the statistics. They knew that boats were not returning. They knew that British depth charge patterns had improved, that aircraft were everywhere, that escorts carried radar that could see in the dark. Training emphasized survival techniques for when, not if, the boat was attacked. Crews were told to expect depth charge runs lasting hours, 300 charges or more, dropped in coordinated patterns designed to create overlapping pressure waves that would crush the hull, even if no single charge struck directly. They were instructed on how to endure the psychological strain, how to remain silent while their steel coffin was shaken apart around them, how to breathe slowly to conserve oxygen when forced to stay submerged for 18 hours, how to accept that rescue was unlikely. These were not the instructions given in 1940. The Allied convoy system succeeded not because of any single innovation, but because of cumulative advantage. Each technological improvement, each tactical refinement, each decoded message added to a defensive capability that eventually overwhelmed German offensive capacity. The U-boat remained a potent weapon in theory, but in practice, it could not survive long enough to be effective. The Type 7 could sink a merchant ship with one torpedo, but firing that torpedo required the boat to reach firing position, which required surviving transit through heavily patrolled waters, avoiding aircraft that could appear without warning, evading escorts that could detect radio transmissions and radar emissions, and then escaping after the attack, while every available Allied asset converged on the area. By mid-1943, the probability of completing this sequence successfully had dropped below sustainable levels. The historical irony is that Germany invested enormous resources in a weapon system that, even at its most effective, could not achieve strategic objectives. The U-boat campaign inflicted terrible losses, sinking 3,500 Allied merchant ships and killing over 70,000 sailors. But it did not sever Britain's supply lines. It did not prevent the buildup of American forces in Britain. It did not stop the convoys that made D-Day possible. The resources Germany expended building submarines, training crews, and maintaining bases might have been more effectively used elsewhere. But Dönitz believed in his doctrine, and Hitler supported him, and so the boats continued to sail even after the battle was lost. In the end, the U-boat captains learned that bravery and tactical skill were not sufficient against an enemy with superior technology, greater industrial capacity, and better intelligence. They learned that weapons effective in one phase of a war could become obsolete in the next. They learned that no amount of individual courage could overcome systemic disadvantage. These lessons were written in salt water and diesel fuel and the bodies of men who never came home. The convoys kept sailing, the U-boats kept dying, and by the war's end the Atlantic belonged to the Allies. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.